The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of City Hall as residents filed into the crowded community meeting room. The air was thick with tension, and Officer Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair at the back of the room, tugging at his collar every few minutes. He wasn't supposed to be there, but his sergeant had insisted that all officers attend this town hall meeting about police reform. The room buzzed with different voices and perspectives. Parents spoke about their fears for their children. Business owners shared stories about their experiences. Community leaders presented statistics about racial profiling in their neighborhood. Bradley's jaw clenched tighter with each speaker, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his chair's armrest. "We need to build trust between our police force and our community," a gentle-voiced elderly woman said, standing with the help of her cane. "My grandchildren shouldn't have to fear the very people who are supposed to protect them." Several people nodded in agreement, some wiping tears from their eyes. Bradley rolled his eyes, catching the attention of his partner, Officer Chen, who shot him a disapproving look. This wasn't the first time Chen had noticed Bradley's dismissive attitude toward community concerns. Just last week, Chen had witnessed Bradley being unnecessarily rough while arresting a young man of color for a minor traffic violation. The meeting continued as community members shared their stories. A high school teacher spoke about how his star student was wrongfully detained while walking home from baseball practice. A nurse described how her brother was harassed while waiting for a bus after his night shift. Each story seemed to make Bradley more agitated. At the front of the room, the police chief listened intently, taking notes and nodding. He had organized this meeting as part of a new initiative to improve police-community relations. "We're here to listen," the chief had said at the start of the meeting. "Real change starts with understanding each other." But understanding seemed to be the last thing on Bradley's mind. When a young woman stood up to share how her father had been wrongfully arrested, Bradley muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few people turned to stare at him, their expressions a mixture of hurt and anger. Officer Chen noticed Bradley's hand hovering near his badge, a nervous habit he developed over his 15 years on the force. Chen had seen the complaint files that had mysteriously disappeared from Bradley's record, the ones about excessive force, the racial slurs witnesses had reported, the random stops that seemed to target specific groups. As the meeting drew to a close, the chief announced plans for new training programs and community outreach initiatives. The room erupted in applause, but Bradley remained seated, arms crossed. His face had turned a deep shade of red, and a vein pulsed visibly on his forehead. Outside, the sunset had given way to dusk. People lingered in small groups, discussing the meeting and sharing their hopes for change. Bradley pushed past them quickly, ignoring the chief's call for officers to stay and mingle with community members. His heavy footsteps echoed down the hall as he headed for his patrol car. What no one knew then was that this meeting was just the beginning. In less than 24 hours, Bradley's deep-seated prejudices would explode into an incident that would shake the entire community to its core and force everyone to confront the reality of what happens when bias goes unchecked in those sworn to protect and serve. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but there was nothing bright about Officer Bradley's mood as he pulled into the police station parking lot. His mind was still churning with anger from last night's community meeting. As he walked into the briefing room, other officers could feel the dark cloud hanging over him. "There's a protest planned for this afternoon," the sergeant announced during the morning briefing. "We need everyone on their best behavior. This is about keeping the peace, not making statements." His eyes lingered on Bradley for a moment longer than necessary. The sergeant had been on the force for 20 years, and his instincts were telling him something wasn't right. By noon, people began gathering outside City Hall. They carried signs calling for police accountability and reform. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, elderly couples held hands, and local religious leaders stood side by side with their congregation members. The crowd was peaceful, their voices raised in unity rather than anger. Bradley paced back and forth along the police line, his hand resting heavily on his belt. His partner from last night, Officer Chen, watched him with growing concern. Maybe you should take a break, Chen suggested quietly. Get some water, cool off a bit. But Bradley brushed him off with a sharp wave of his hand. The summer heat beat down on the crowd as more people joined the demonstration. A group of teenagers handed out water bottles to both protesters and police officers. Some officers accepted with grateful nods, but Bradley turned away when they approached him. His face was flushed, and sweat trickled down his neck despite the cooling breeze. News vans pulled up one by one, their cameras capturing the scene. Local reporters interviewed protesters about their hopes for change. "We're not here to fight," one community leader told the cameras. "We're here because we believe in a better future for our children." The atmosphere remained peaceful, but Bradley's tension was visible in every movement. He jumped at small sounds, his head snapping around at sudden movements. Other officers began to give him a wide berth, recognizing the signs of someone about to snap. The sergeant noticed too. He'd seen officers lose their cool before, and Bradley was showing all the warning signs. He started making his way through the crowd of uniformed officers, intending to pull Bradley off the line. But before he could reach him, something happened that would change everything. A well-dressed man approached the police line, his walk purposeful and confident. He was trying to reach the city hall steps, where he was expected for an important meeting. Several officers recognized him immediately, but Bradley wasn't one of them. His world had narrowed to a tunnel of prejudice and anger, and all he could see was someone he viewed as a threat. The crowd's chanting had grown louder, though still peaceful. News cameras swung toward the police line, drawn by some sixth sense that told them something was about to happen. The sergeant quickened his pace, but he was still too far away. Officer Chen called out a warning, but his voice was lost in the general noise. Time seemed to slow down as Bradley's fingers flexed and his stance shifted. The man approaching the line reached for something in his pocket, just his identification, as it would turn out. But Bradley wasn't waiting to find out. In his mind, shaped by years of unchecked bias and growing anger, he was already convinced he knew exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. No one could have predicted what would happen next, but everyone who was there would remember it forever. It was the moment that would force their city to confront its deepest problems, and change the lives of everyone involved in ways they never could have imagined. The well-dressed man approached the police line with the calm confidence of someone who had every right to be there. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie neat, and his shoes shined. He was clearly heading to an important meeting. The protest crowd had parted naturally to let him through, many of them giving him respectful nods of recognition. Bradley stood at his post, his mind clouded by the previous day's anger and his own deep-seated prejudices. He watched the man's approach through narrowed eyes, completely missing the subtle signals that would have told any other officer that this was someone important. The man's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, reaching for his identification. "Stop right there." Bradley's voice cracked like a whip across the previously peaceful scene. Several nearby officers turned their heads, surprised by the aggressive tone. The well-dressed man paused, his expression remaining composed even as Bradley advanced toward him. "Sir, I'm just trying to reach the building. I have a meeting and my credentials are right here," the man said calmly, continuing his slow reach toward his pocket. His voice carried the weight of authority, but Bradley was beyond hearing such subtleties now. Officer Chen stepped forward, recognizing the situation was about to spiral out of control. "Bradley, wait," he started to say, but Bradley was already moving, his face twisted with unfounded suspicion. The crowd had gone eerily quiet, dozens of phone cameras now pointed at the unfolding scene. The only sounds were the quiet whir of news cameras and the rustle of clothes as people shifted to get a better view. The man stood his ground, maintaining his dignity even as Bradley invaded his personal space. "I said stop moving," Bradley growled, his hand now resting on his belt. The man slowly raised both hands, his expression a mixture of disbelief and sad understanding. He'd seen this type of behavior before, but never expected to experience it himself, especially not here, not now. "Officer, I'm simply trying to show you my identification," the man explained again, his voice steady and clear enough for nearby cameras to pick up. "There's no need for this level of aggression." Other officers began moving toward the scene, recognizing something was very wrong. The sergeant was pushing through the crowd of uniformed officers, his face showing growing alarm. But they were all too far away to prevent what happened next. The man, still trying to defuse the situation, took a small step backward to maintain a safe distance from Bradley's aggressive posture. "Let's handle this professionally," he suggested, maintaining eye contact with Bradley. But Bradley saw only what his prejudiced mind wanted to see. In his distorted view, the small step backward was an act of defiance, the calm voice was a challenge to his authority, and the hand that had been reaching for identification was a threat. The crowd gasped as Bradley's stance shifted. The man's eyes widened slightly as he realized reasoning wasn't going to work. A local reporter took a step forward, her microphone extended, sensing that history was about to be made, though not in the way anyone would have wanted. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. Officer Chen was still moving forward, his warning shout just beginning to form. The sergeant was breaking into a run. Dozens of cameras were recording, and in the middle of it all, a well-dressed man in an expensive suit was about to become the center of a story that would shake their city to its core. No one in the crowd could have known that this man was far more important than he appeared. And Bradley, blinded by his own biases, was seconds away from making the biggest mistake of his career, one that would force everyone to confront the ugly truth about prejudice in their community. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. Bradley's face contorted with uncontrolled rage as he suddenly lunged forward, his fist connecting with the well-dressed man's jaw. The sound of the impact seemed to echo across the suddenly silent crowd. Time itself appeared to slow down as people watched in horror. The well-dressed man staggered but didn't fall. His hand went to his face, his eyes showing not anger but a deep sadness. He straightened his tie with his other hand, maintaining his dignity even in this shocking moment. Blood trickled from a small cut on his lip, staining his crisp white shirt. He just hit him. Someone in the crowd screamed, breaking the stunned silence. Dozens of phones captured the moment from every angle, their owners barely breathing as they recorded. News cameras zoomed in on the scene, broadcasting the incident live across local channels. Bradley stood there, chest heaving, his fist still clenched. For a split second, a look of satisfaction crossed his face, the kind of look that would later haunt him in every replay of the video. The well-dressed man simply looked at him, his gaze steady and somehow compassionate despite what had just happened. Officer Chen finally reached them, his face pale with shock. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked the well-dressed man, deliberately stepping between him and Bradley. Other officers rushed forward, their boots pounding against the pavement. The sergeant was running now, his voice carrying across the square as he shouted orders. The crowd had pressed forward, their peaceful protest forgotten in the face of this violence. But the well-dressed man raised his hand, and somehow, incredibly, the crowd stilled. There was something about his presence, his calm in the face of chaos, that commanded respect. Bradley's satisfaction began to fade as he noticed the reactions of his fellow officers. Some looked at him with disgust, others with disbelief. A few had their hands over their badges, as if trying to distance themselves from his actions. But it wasn't their reactions that would haunt his dreams in the days to come. The well-dressed man pulled out his wallet, the same motion that had triggered Bradley's attack. But instead of an ordinary ID, he removed a different kind of credential. The gold emblem caught the sunlight, and Bradley's face began to drain of color as recognition finally dawned. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. People were pointing, whispering, some even crying. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, asking why the police officer had hit the mayor. The word mayor rippled through the crowd like a wave, reaching Bradley's ears and making his knees go weak. Camera flashes exploded around them as photographers captured what would become iconic images. The mayor standing tall despite his bloody lip, Bradley's face showing the first signs of devastating realization, and Officer Chen's protective stance between them. The mayor dabbed at his lip with a pristine white handkerchief, the small spot of blood, a stark contrast to the fabric. He looked directly at Bradley, not with hatred or anger, but with a determined resolve that spoke of changes to come. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried clearly across the now silent square. But before he could say the words that would be replayed on every news channel for weeks to come, Bradley's world spun sideways. The weight of what he'd done, who he'd attacked, crashed down on him like a physical blow. His badge felt impossibly heavy on his chest, and the faces of the crowd blurred into a sea of accusing eyes. In that moment, as cameras clicked and people watched in stunned silence, everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would change their city forever. The peaceful protest had turned into something far more significant, a moment of truth that would force everyone to confront the reality of prejudice and power. Mr. Mayor. Officer Chen's voice cut through the tense silence. The words hit Bradley like a physical blow, making him stumble backward. His face had turned ashen, and tiny beads of sweat appeared on his forehead as the full reality of his actions sank in. The mayor straightened his suit jacket with calm precision, the gesture somehow making the moment even more powerful. A thin line of blood still traced down from his lip, but he made no move to wipe it away. Instead, he stood there, every inch the dignified public servant, letting everyone see exactly what had just happened. "Someone get the chief on the phone right now," the sergeant barked, his voice trembling with barely controlled anger. Two officers immediately pulled out their phones, their hands shaking as they dialed. The news cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of this historic moment. Bradley's mind raced frantically. He had just assaulted the city's first black mayor, a former civil rights attorney who had won the election by a landslide. The same mayor who had been pushing for police reform. The same mayor who had organized last night's community meeting. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Social media was already exploding. The crowd's phones lit up with notifications as the video spread like wildfire. People who had been filming immediately started streaming live, their comment sections filling with shocked responses from around the city and beyond. Officer Bradley, the mayor, spoke for the first time since the punch, his voice steady and clear. "I believe this is exactly the kind of situation we were discussing at last night's meeting." The irony of his words hung heavy in the air. Several officers winced, and someone in the crowd let out a bitter laugh. The protest signs that called for police reform now seemed prophetic. One poster reading, "Who will police the police?" was raised higher, drawing news cameras like a magnet. The mayor's presence transformed what could have been just another incident into a powerful symbol of everything that needed to change. Bradley's badge felt like it was burning through his chest. His hand went to it unconsciously, and for the first time, he seemed to question whether he deserved to wear it. The crowd watched his internal struggle with a mixture of anger and satisfaction. This was accountability happening in real time. The chief of police arrived within minutes, his car's lights flashing as he pulled up to the scene. He took one look at the mayor's face, then at Bradley's trembling form, and his expression hardened. "Your badge and gun," he said to Bradley, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Now." As Bradley slowly unclipped his badge, his hands shaking, the mayor did something unexpected. He stepped forward, tissue still pressed to his lip, and addressed the crowd. "Let this moment teach us something," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "Let it show us why we need change, but also how we respond to injustice." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Even the news reporters lowered their microphones, not wanting to miss what was coming next. The mayor's next words would be quoted in newspapers across the country, shared millions of times on social media, and studied in law enforcement training programs for years to come. Bradley stood frozen, his badge halfway off his uniform, as the full weight of his actions pressed down on him. His career was over, but more than that, he had just become the very example of what was wrong with the system. His own prejudices, his unchecked bias, his anger. It had all led to this moment of complete professional destruction. The video of the incident was already being shared thousands of times online. Bradley's name would soon be trending on social media. His action had just become a defining moment in the ongoing national conversation about police reform and racial bias. And as he finally handed over his badge, his hands still shaking, he realized that his punch had done more to prove the protesters' point than their demonstration ever could. Inside the mayor's office, just 30 minutes after the incident, a crowd of reporters packed the room. Camera flashes lit up the space like lightning as the mayor sat at his desk, a small ice pack held to his jaw. Despite the assault, he maintained an air of quiet strength that commanded attention. "What happened today?" the mayor began, his voice clear despite his swollen lip, "is exactly why I ran for office in the first place." He placed the ice pack down, letting everyone see the mark Bradley's punch had left. The photographers' cameras clicked rapidly, capturing what would become tomorrow's front page image. Outside the office windows, the crowd from the protest had grown even larger. People held candles despite the daylight, creating a powerful visual statement of support. Signs that originally called for police reform now bore messages of support for the mayor and demands for immediate action. The police chief stood in the corner of the office, his face lined with worry and shame. He'd already announced Bradley's immediate suspension, but everyone knew that wouldn't be enough. The mayor's next words would determine the direction of not just Bradley's fate, but potentially the entire police department's future. "I could press charges," the mayor continued, causing the reporters to lean forward eagerly. "I could call for Officer Bradley's immediate termination. I could use this moment to divide our city further." He paused, touching his bruised jaw thoughtfully. "But that's not why I'm sitting in this chair." The room fell silent. Even the cameras stopped clicking for a moment. Outside, the crowd's chants faded as people gathered around their phones, watching the live stream of the press conference. The mayor stood up, straightening his tie, and walked around to the front of his desk. "This incident," he said, gesturing to his injury, "is a symptom of a larger problem. And while Officer Bradley must face consequences for his actions, simply punishing him won't solve the underlying issues that brought us to this point." Social media was exploding with reactions. The video of the punch had already been viewed millions of times. Hashtags calling for justice were trending nationwide. But the mayor wasn't finished speaking, and his next words would surprise everyone. "I'm announcing the formation of a special task force," he declared, pulling out a folder that had been prepared long before today's incident. "We will examine not just this incident, but every aspect of our police department's training, policies, and culture. Officer Bradley's actions today didn't happen in a vacuum." The chief of police stepped forward then, his movements stiff but determined. "The department fully supports this initiative," he announced, though the strain in his voice was evident. "What happened today is unacceptable, and we must take concrete steps to ensure it never happens again." In the hospital where Bradley's punch had sent him for precautionary examination, the mayor took a moment between interviews to look out the window. The city stretched out below, its streets filled with people reacting to the day's events. Some were protesting, some were holding prayer vigils, but all were united in their demand for change. A nurse entered with discharge papers, pausing when she recognized him. "My grandson saw what happened," she said quietly. "He asked me why the police officer was so angry." The mayor turned to her, seeing the pain and hope in her eyes. "What should I tell him?" The mayor's response was interrupted by his phone buzzing with messages from city council members, community leaders, and citizens. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. How would this moment change their city? What would happen to Bradley? How would they prevent this from happening again? As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, casting long shadows across the city, the mayor knew that tomorrow would bring hard work and difficult conversations. But for now, he had to focus on turning this moment of crisis into an opportunity for real, lasting change. The Internal Affairs Office buzzed with activity as investigators pored over Bradley's personnel files. What they found painted a troubling picture that went far beyond the day's violent incident. File cabinets that hadn't been opened in years revealed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. "Look at this," one investigator said, holding up a yellowed complaint form from 5 years ago. The paper trembled slightly in her hand as she read it. A young man had reported Bradley for excessive force during a routine traffic stop. The complaint had mysteriously disappeared from official records, but here it was, buried in an old filing cabinet. More documents emerged as the day went on. Witness statements describing racial slurs, reports of unnecessary roughness, comments from concerned fellow officers. Each piece of paper added to a story that should have been addressed years ago. The investigation team worked through lunch, their faces growing grimmer with each new discovery. Officer Chen sat in the interview room, his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. "I knew something wasn't right," he told the investigators. The way he acted at traffic stops, the comments he made when he thought no one was listening. "I should have said something sooner." The guilt in his voice was painful to hear. Down the hall, tech specialists reviewed body camera footage from Bradley's past arrests. The cameras had captured everything: the aggressive tone, the unnecessary escalations, the pattern of targeting certain groups. One specialist had to step outside for air after watching particularly disturbing footage of Bradley harassing a group of teenagers who were simply walking home from school. The police chief stood in his office, blinds drawn, watching news coverage of the incident on multiple screens. Each channel showed the same footage from different angles: Bradley's fist connecting with the mayor's face, the shocked crowd, the aftermath. The chief's phone hadn't stopped ringing since it happened. "We're finding incidents dating back 10 years, an investigator reported, dropping another stack of files on the chief's desk. Complaints filed and forgotten. Warnings ignored. Transfers that looked more like cover-ups. Each word felt like another nail in the department's coffin of accountability." In the break room, officers gathered in small groups, their voices low but intense. Some defended Bradley, claiming the stress of the job had gotten to him. Others shook their heads, remembering times they'd witnessed his behavior and stayed silent. The division within the department was becoming as clear as the evidence against Bradley. A senior officer approached the investigation team late in the afternoon. "There's something you need to see," he said, pulling out his personal phone. He had saved text messages from Bradley, messages filled with prejudice and anger. "I kept these as insurance," he explained, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have done more than just save them." The mayor's office requested hourly updates on the investigation's progress. Each report made it clearer that this wasn't just about one punch or one officer. This was about a system that had allowed prejudice to fester unchecked, about colleagues who had seen the signs but chosen to look away. As evening fell, the investigation team gathered in the conference room to compile their findings. Papers covered every surface, each one a piece of the puzzle that showed how today's incident was inevitable. Bradley's prejudices hadn't appeared overnight. They had grown in the shadows of silence and inaction. The final report would be devastating, not just for Bradley, but for every person who had the power to stop him and didn't. For every supervisor who moved complaints to the bottom of the pile. For every colleague who laughed uncomfortably at his jokes instead of reporting them. The evidence painted a picture of not just one officer's failure, but an entire system's breakdown. A junior investigator summed it up best as they prepared to present their findings. "The real question isn't how this happened today. It's how we let it happen for so long." Her words hung in the air as the team gathered their documents. knowing that tomorrow's presentation would change their department forever. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and citizens alike as Bradley made his way inside for the disciplinary hearing. His once proud stance was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. The crisp uniform he'd worn for 15 years had been replaced by a plain dark suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. Inside the hearing room, the evidence against Bradley was laid out piece by piece. The punch that had started it all now seemed almost minor compared to the years of documented misconduct that had been uncovered. The mayor sat in the front row, his bruise still visible but fading, watching the proceedings with steady eyes. "The department has failed," the police chief stated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "We failed to address these issues when they first appeared. We failed to protect our citizens. And we failed to uphold the standards that our badge represents." Each word fell like a hammer, drawing nods from the Oversight Committee. Bradley's union representative sat beside him, but even he looked uncomfortable as more evidence was presented. Body camera footage played on screens around the room, showing incident after incident. The pattern was undeniable. Some officers in the audience had to look away, recognizing their own moments of silence in the face of Bradley's behavior. "Your actions weren't just an assault on me," the mayor testified, standing at the podium. "They were an assault on everything our city stands for, on the trust between law enforcement and our community." His words carried no anger, only a deep disappointment that seemed to weigh heavier than any punishment could. The Oversight Committee took less than an hour to reach their decision. Bradley's termination was immediate and permanent. But the mayor's influence had added another layer to the consequences. Instead of just punishment, there would be education. Instead of just penalty, there would be reform. "Officer Bradley will face criminal charges," the committee chairperson announced. "But this department will face changes. Mandatory bias training, community oversight, and a complete review of all existing policies." The announcement drew murmurs from the crowd. This was more than just one officer's punishment. This was systemic change. Outside, protesters who had gathered expecting to demand justice found themselves witnessing it instead. Signs calling for action were replaced with messages of hope. The mayor spoke to the crowd, his presence a testament to leadership in the face of adversity. "Today isn't about revenge," he told them, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps. "It's about responsibility. About acknowledging our failures and committing to do better." Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders, wanting them to witness this moment of change. Back inside, Bradley sat alone in the empty hearing room, staring at his former badge on the table. Years of unchecked bias and anger had led to this moment. His career was over, but perhaps his story would serve as a warning to others who might follow the same path. The police chief announced new policies that same afternoon. Every complaint would be investigated. Every incident would be reviewed. The wall of silence that had protected bad behavior would be torn down, replaced by transparency and accountability. At the police academy across town, instructors were already updating their training materials. Bradley's case would become a teaching example, not just of what not to do, but of how bias can corrupt even those sworn to protect and serve. "Your badge is a symbol of public trust," an instructor told her new recruits that evening, holding up a newspaper with Bradley's story. "And that trust must be earned every day, with every action, with every citizen you encounter." The young faces looking back at her seemed to understand the weight of those words more clearly than ever before. 6 months after the incident, the police department looked different. Not just in policies and procedures, but in the way officers interacted with the community. The mayor's reforms had taken root, transforming what had once been a source of tension into a model for change. The community center buzzed with activity as officers and citizens gathered for their weekly dialogue session. Children played basketball with police officers who now knew their names and stories. Elderly residents shared coffee with beat cops, discussing neighborhood concerns with comfortable familiarity. "I never thought I'd see this," Officer Chen remarked to a community leader as they watched the scene. 6 months ago, there was so much distrust. Now look at us. He gestured to where a rookie officer was helping a young girl with her homework, both of them laughing over a math problem. The mayor's office had become a hub of transformation. The walls were covered with photos showing progress. Officers attending cultural sensitivity training, community meetings with real dialogue, joint volunteer projects between police and citizens. Each image told a story of bridges being rebuilt. In the police academy, new recruits watched body camera footage from the day of Bradley's punch. But now they also saw what came after: the changes, the healing, the rebuilding of trust. This is why we do things differently now, their instructor explained. This is why every interaction matters. The Oversight Committee, once seen as adversaries by many officers, had become partners in progress. They worked together to identify problems before they could grow, to support officers who needed help, and to ensure that no one's prejudices could ever again hide behind a badge. Local news stations ran special reports marking the 6-month anniversary of the incident. They showed before and after statistics: complaints down, community engagement up, trust rebuilding step by step. But more powerful than the numbers were the stories people shared. "My kids used to be scared when they saw a police car," one mother told the reporters. "Now they wave, and the officers wave back. They know each other's names. That's the kind of change we needed." Her words reflected what many in the community felt: hope replacing fear, trust replacing suspicion. The mayor still carried a small scar on his lip, a reminder of that day. But he wore it like a badge of honor now, proof that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. In his latest community meeting, he shared his vision for the future. "What happened that day wasn't the end of our story," he told the gathered crowd. "It was the beginning of a new chapter. We're writing it together, every day, with every positive interaction between our officers and our citizens." The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was heartfelt. Former officer Bradley's story had become a cautionary tale in police departments across the country. Other cities sent representatives to learn from what had happened, to understand how one moment of unchecked bias had led to lasting change. The final piece of the transformation came in the form of a new training center, named not after any person, but after the principle that now guided the department: trust through understanding. Inside, officers old and new learned not just procedures and protocols, but the human stories behind them. As the sun set on another day of progress, the mayor stood at his office window, watching officers and citizens leaving the community center together. The scene below wasn't perfect. Change never is, but it was real. What had started with a punch thrown in anger had become a punchline in their city's history, marking the moment when everything began to change for the better.